with Greg Whiteley. No one, of course, is watching except those in the room, but we're live anyway.
Can you guys help me figure out the most handsome angle for me?
That's looking pretty good. That's pretty nice. You've got some real nice dramatic lighting.
Yeah.
So you're in motion, literally. I can tell.
I thought all day, Duane, about the most interesting shot I could give you, and the best I could come up with is to get in my car and drive.
I'm just glad you're not driving while you're doing this.
Oh, I am. I'm using my feet.
Okay. And I'm disappointed that there's no like hood mount or something, you know? I mean, that would be a little more interesting.
This is a documentary film, Duane.
Great. Hey, we've got about 25 people here. We just watched your film. It is a fabulous film. I love it more and more every time I see it. It's just so great. And I've told them a little bit about who you are. I'm going to ask you a few questions. Then we'll let them come up and ask you some questions, if that's all right.
I would love it.
And my phone died, so I have a student here who's got your number in case we just get disconnected or something like that.
Okay.
So my first question, I think you discussed this a bit when we were with you at Sundance, and it has to do with documentary filmmaking. Can you tell us about how you got into documentary filmmaking and if that was ever part of your plan and why? Or why not?
I went to film school with the idea that I wanted to make movies like Raiders of the Lost Ark. And as I started progressing through film school, I started to get turned on to films like the French New Wave, you know, and you enter, and you guys, maybe some of your students, you're right in this phase right now where you start to become pretentious in your taste. And I was definitely one of those, but I for sure was going to do something scripted, so I began writing scripts, directing scripted content. I started a theater company in LA, and we would go into bars or street corners, and we would perform one-act plays with the goal of trying to fool the patrons of the place that what they were watching was real. And, you know, all of this very highbrow, artsy stuff. And at about that time, I was assigned to home teach Arthur Kane. And you can't talk to Arthur for more than 2 sentences without him telling you about his band, the New York Dolls. And so over the course of 4 years, I just heard story after story, and I just loved him, and I loved the stories. And I really thought I was going to turn his life into a great screenplay. You know, when you're a graduate film student, everything is a potential screenplay. And it's especially true of his life. I mean, he was just tell these stories. You couldn't possibly believe they were true. But he called me one day and he said, my band is reuniting. Morrissey has reunited my band. Would you give me a ride to the pawn shop? Some members from the church have loaned me some money, and I need a ride to go get my guitar so I can start practicing. And I just happened to have a camera as part of a project I was doing in my back seat. And so I just asked him, can I film you going to get your bass guitar out of the pawn shop? And that's what started my career as a documentary filmmaker.
So at what point did you say, this is it, I've got to keep filming this? Because, I mean, how that couldn't have been too much sooner than they actually went out to New York and stuff.
Yeah, well, so I filmed that, and I just started telling some friends that I was working with about my friend and what had happened. And somebody just mentioned, goes, yeah, it sounds like a really cool idea for a film. And I thought, yeah, we all just kind of agreed. And I mentioned it to Arthur. I said, would you mind if I went back with you to New York, if I could scrape up the money to go back there and film you? And he said, yeah, sure, because you'll make a movie and it will be seen by millions of people. And I remember just sort of smiling, thinking, yeah, all right, we'll be lucky if anybody in the ward watches it. But yeah, as we went and filmed the reunion, there started to be a momentum, and it was kind of a delicate period in my life financially. We had just had my son, who's with us in the car right here. That's how old the film is. He was a baby. But I should say he was 4 years old. Well, I'm sorry, 3. And no, sorry, 5. You were 5. Yeah, Scout was born too. I had 2 kids, and I had no money. And I sat down with my wife, and I said, look, I'm thinking about following Arthur back to New York. And this is kind of a funny story, Duane. I had just been hired to shoot what's called a sizzle for Mattel's new Barbie Playhouse. I thought this was huge. I thought, oh, I'd made it. You know, I got a funny story about that. I'll tell you later. But it was really kind of leaving that work behind to go follow crazy Arthur Kane to New York and then to London. And I remember mentioning it to my wife. And if my wife had said anything other than what she said, like if she had expressed some level of hesitation or concern or said something along the lines of, well, we've got 2 kids now, we've got potentially this steady gig, maybe this isn't the most responsible thing, anything of the sort, I would have jettisoned the idea and said no. But as soon as I described the idea to her, she said, oh, that sounds great, you have to do that. And I don't tell this story a lot. Duane, forgive me if I told this story to your group before, but there was, all along the way, it felt so precarious that I remember thinking I would do this thing that I think I kind of developed this habit when I was on my Mormon mission, where you would go, all right, Lord, if I'm supposed to go down this street, show me some sign, you know. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. But I was really serious about this film. This really felt like either a complete waste of time or it could be something great. And so I just went, and I remember saying that prayer. All right, I need a sign. And part of what it was, Duane, is I was short cash. I budgeted out to the penny what I would need to get to New York and to London and back. And I was short. Back then, it was a significant amount of money. And I had it rounded out to the closest $100. So I was short a few $1,000s, but to the $100 I'd rounded it out. And I remember just praying for this sign. And a guy from the ward came up to me and said, hey, I hear you're thinking about making this movie about Arthur's reunion. You know, the ward was kind of abuzz with this. I said, yeah, I am thinking about it. And he goes, look, can I invest in this film? I'd like to invest. And I said, well, how much? And to the dollar of that, rounded up to that $100. He just said, I don't know. And he mentioned the price. And I just kind of was filled with a confidence that I was on the Lord's errand. And there was a lot of bumps along the road, you know, along the way. There was people telling us we couldn't film and other obstacles that are just, I've learned now, are normal to making any film. But I was just filled with a confidence, largely based on that experience. And I just knew we were gonna finish. I knew we'd make it back safe.
Okay, great. That's awesome. Well, you did. Let's go forward to Sundance. You got into Sundance. I'm sure that was something. Tell us a little bit about your, if that was the surprise of that and just the reaction to that and what that did for you.
Yeah, that's one of the great phone calls that a documentary filmmaker gets in their career. It typically happens sometime around Thanksgiving. I just remember we were editing, hustling to finish the film. We submitted a 45-minute version of the film that didn't have any concert footage, and it didn't have the Morrissey interview. We hadn't shot it yet.
Wow.
And if you can believe it, that got in. I just remember getting that phone call. One of the programmers of the documentary, I mean, that'd be such a fun job, to have that job for that 2 days when you're calling everybody and telling them that they're in the festival. I mean, it just, you know, it feels life-changing, and in many respects, it is life-changing.
Yeah, awesome. And tell me real quick about the MIT project and how that came to be and what that was about.
Well, with MIT, and what you'll find is this kind of happens. You get something off the ground, and just finishing a film will lead to other opportunities. I really believe that. Just finishing a project, even if the project isn't great, it's almost like you're an airplane pilot. And I know that you and I've mentioned this before. You start logging miles, and you just kind of get this confidence, like, yeah, I can do this, and it leads to other opportunities. this was true with Mitt. I remember reading an article that he was thinking about running for president, and I thought, well, he'll be the first serious Mormon candidate for president. And I thought, well, this will be interesting. And what kind of fueled this interest is when New York Doll played in Boston, somebody emailed me and said, hey, I loved your film. I looked you up online, and you might be interested to know that the governor of Massachusetts is sitting right in front of me. It was this little theater at Harvard Square. And so, I became, that perked my interest. We went and heard the governor speak when he came to Los Angeles, and it looked like he was thinking about running for president. And my wife almost attacked him. Like, after the speech was done, he came to this rope line, and we went up to the front, and my wife never does this, but she just, like, grabbed him and said, hey, you saw my husband's movie. And he goes, oh, well, what movie is this? He said, New York Doll. And he stops, and he comes back and goes, I saw that movie twice. I love that movie. And that kind of started the ball rolling of eventually me giving up 7 years of my life to film that guy running for president twice.
All right. Tell us about the Most Likely to Succeed, how you're doing with it, and what you're doing. You also mentioned that you have a new project about to start.
Yeah. So the Most Likely to Succeed is a documentary that examines our current educational system, and that played at last year's Sundance. I'm sorry, this year's Sundance.
By the way, I have to interrupt you. That the current framing and lighting is very dramatic.
Oh, right here?
Yeah, it looks great. The little pink haze, the pink lighting. Yeah, you kind of got some novelty lighting going. It's really nice.
Well, that's not bad. That is not bad.
The cars in the back, the red light coming in.
Yeah, we got some brakes right up here.
That's good. It's working for you. It's working for you.
I got to remember this. So it's a much different film than I've ever done before. I've always made movies in which you kind of pick interesting characters and you trust some things, interesting things are going to happen to them, and you just hang on for dear life. You just film and hope something happens. And I've learned over time that almost always, if you're willing to be patient enough, a story will unfold. And this was different. This was an essay piece, and the film was, I was asked to read a book and then to come and to give them my thoughts on the book. And once I had read the book, I really was taken by it. Both my son and my daughter are going to school. They're in schools now, and there was something about their school experience that was bothering me well before I read the book. But as I read the book, I thought, that's exactly what's bothering me. And so it just became really fun for the last 2 years to make a movie that's basically, an argument. I'm just making an argument. I'm trying to make it as gentle as I can. I'm not trying to manipulate anybody into a particular viewpoint. But I am trying to, with as much passion as I can, explain what I think I've figured out about U.S. schools.
And it's a great film. It's a really great film.
Thanks, Duane.
Let's see, you just froze up. Okay, you're still there. I'm going to open it up to questions. So, guys, please come on up. Stand right here. Tell Greg your name and ask away. All right. Are you on a long drive or how much time do we have with you?
Yeah, the phone can go wherever I go. So listen, we can keep this going. I'll just tuck myself into bed and we'll just keep going.
All right, come on up, guys.
Hi, my name is Stefania. I'm really short.
Sonia?
I'm the one that
right?
texted you.
Oh, hey, good to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Thank you so much for doing this for us. Oh, thank you. So I love that you started just filming him going into the pawn shop and getting his guitar. That's so cool. I was curious how the story kind of came together, how your process came together, at what point you started to see it unfold, and especially like during the process of filming and especially in the editing room, how you kind of put it together, made it fit a really nice dramatic structure, made it hit all the right points, and finally come to a really great conclusion. And also, how did Arthur's death affect the process, and how did that work for you?
Yeah, those are all good questions. Arthur's death was so sudden that we that we really hadn't begun editing yet. I hadn't begun editing. I don't know that you should do this for every film, but what was a good exercise was, for me, I was really intimidated by making a feature film. You'd think 80, 90 minutes, that's so long. I'd never made anything that long before.
Right.
That's why I was nervous. Like, do I have enough footage? What do I do? And I started by making just a short film first, a short 7-minute film. And I did it for Arthur's funeral, just to show people at the ward. And then that became the template, that structure. We just expanded to 90 minutes. I think the biggest hurdle that we had, the thing that we wrestled with the most, was how much of the film should describe the history of the New York Dolls. And at the time that we were filming, there was a very popular VH1 series called Behind the Music. And so we were wondering, well, how can we do this in a way that's not just a behind the music, but we do need to explain who the band is. That's relevant. And so that was a bit of a learning curve, trying to figure out, well, how much of this movie should be history and how much should just be the story of Arthur. And there were several versions of the film that went back and forth until where I think we landed was the kind of a sweet spot.
So it was very much like writing a script almost, going through different drafts and things like that.
Oh, I will tell you the only difference, I shouldn't say the only difference, but the fundamental difference between directing scripted material and non-scripted material, a documentary, is that in scripted material you write it and then you shoot it. And in a documentary you shoot it and then you write it. And if I'm being honest, in some cases, the education film, and then you shoot it and then rewrite it again. That makes sense?
Yeah, very cool. Thank you. I also had one other question. How did you get hooked up with Rod Santiano? Because I know him and I love him.
Oh, isn't Rod great? Well, Rod was this very talented cinematographer at Art Center where I was going to school, and he was the person that, and every film school has them. If you have an idea and you want to, everybody's got the one cinematographer that's considered the consensus best, and he was that person. Everybody wanted to use him. And so I wrangled him. I remember he was so cocky. He was a year ahead of me, and like just begging him to work on this little student film I had, and we had a really great experience. We became good friends, and he was the first person I turned to shoot New York Doll. And if any of you guys have got projects, many of you are going to go on. You're going to be successful, especially if you're working up there in Utah. You should definitely grab him. He's the best.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Rod?
Oh, Rod.
Hi, I'm Ryan.
Hey, Brian.
So I love the polarities in New York Doll, and they're so extreme. And I was wondering if you could talk about how it was for you to go from interviewing, these old punk rock stars, and then on the other hand you have the older ladies in the Family History Center and stuff like that. And like, was it ever confusing, like the feelings that you were coming up with when you're editing and stuff, and even interviewing? And did it make you kind of ever unsure of if it was gonna come together?
I think what I was most nervous about was being accused of making fun of the church, because those old women are. We'd have an editing bin where we were cataloging all the footage, and we had an editing bin called Muppets, and that's where we would put all of them, all their footage, them as the Muppets.
As in, like the two old dudes Muppets?
Yeah, I mean, not just because they're old, but they have such almost just defined, warm, almost comically warm features. And I was nervous about, they're just so funny, and by forcing that juxtaposition, it becomes even funnier. So I became a little nervous. I don't want to make fun of them, but and so I hope we didn't do that. But it was just so hilarious to watch how they would and in a way that I thought was heartwarming, how delighted they were in Arthur in this fact that he was doing this reunion. So yeah, I don't know if that's answering your question. To me, that was from the onset. That's the whole theme of the movie, is this collision between these two worlds and the result of that collision.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much.
Hi, how's it going? I'm Evan.
Hey, Evan.
Wow, I'm short too now, I guess. Turns out.
We're no judging.
Okay, don't judge me. So, I love music, and I love a lot of the music in your film. Like, a lot of those bands are awesome bands. So I was wondering, how much of those bands did you know before you started? Did you know the New York Dolls, like their music, or any of that? And afterwards, did you start liking them and listening to them? I'm just curious.
That's a great question. No, I did not know who the New York Dolls were. And when the first concert I ever went to was Huey Lewis and the News. So that gives you an idea of just where my pedestrian musical tastes were. As I got a little older, I had some college roommates and some friends in high school that would turn me on to the Ramones. I never quite appreciated the Sex Pistols, or I never enjoyed their music, but I appreciated where they sat. And I became a bit of a music fan of that. You know, I to this day, the Clash are one of my favorite bands, and
Yeah.
I now adore the New York Dolls. I've seen them a few times in concert, and I feel privileged to stay in touch with a couple of them, and I really do like their music.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Hi, my name is Mike. I've seen all your films at Sundance, and they're great, and I love the Q&A sessions. And I can't remember where you commented about the funeral, but there were some really funny and warm things that occurred at the funeral. Can you talk about the funeral of Arthur?
Yeah. Well, you have a good memory. I'd forgotten all about that. So Arthur passed away, and word got out, and it was the greatest. Speaking of the collision of two worlds, you had this is fascinating to me. So in the first 4 or 5 rows of the chapel was full of rock royalty in all of their glory. Studded leather overcoats, capes, canes, and big hats and sunglasses. It was like the Kentucky Derby in hell. And then, you know, as Mormons are wont to do, those guys got there a half an hour early and were super respectful, super humble, like, oh, you know, what are we? And then you had members of the ward sitting mainly in the back. And when the funeral ended, we showed the film, and then the funeral service ended, and it was just so fun to watch members of the Relief Society hugging members of Blondie. it was great.
And you also mentioned that the other half of the church, the rows, all the Mormons were late. Everybody else was early, right?
Yeah, no, they showed up predictably late.
Hi, I'm Mandy. I actually met you at Sundance.
Hi, Mandy. Were you just this last Sundance, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. How's it going? How's the semester going? Did
Good.
any of that advice help you? Did anything that was said in that panel, was that?
Yeah, it was great, but I have been holding on to a question since then for you.
Oh, wow.
Okay, so you said there that in film school, if you would have had to sit and learn about documentary filming, that you would have been like bored out of your mind or something like that. Why do you say that? Like, what makes documentary filmmaking different that, in your opinion, would be boring to learn about? because I'm very interested in documentary and making them. So
I think what I've had to learn to do, and I had to learn to do this in New York Doll, I had to learn to be more passive than I'm naturally inclined to be. I had to be more patient. I'm sort of someone that I if something's not happening, I want to make it happen. And I think if you're making a scripted film, that's a good tool. You kind of become the master of the universe. I'm gonna, I need a line here. Well, then I'm gonna write it, and it will be so. But in a documentary film, you're sitting there going, I really need a line here, and you just have to accept that there isn't, and you got to be patient and wait for the drama to happen. And it's been a really great. I don't know if I'll ever get the chance to do a scripted film or do scripted content, but if I do, these last 10 years will be really helpful because I've learned to be more nuanced in recognizing what is inherently dramatic, what is worth filming, what is a story that's worth telling, and so I think sort of teaching documentary, especially fly-on-the-wall documentary filmmaking, you're kind of teaching someone how to be a nature photographer, and describing that can bore you to tears.
Right.
When you're doing that and you're invested in the story and you're invested in what Arthur has gone through or whoever your character, you end up falling in love with whoever your characters are. And so very small moments become infinitely interesting. I don't know, I don't know what the percentages are of your classroom and how many of them are LDS, but I'm assuming that many of you are familiar with the fact that we call people from our congregations to be bishops and counselors and Relief Society presidents. And if you serve in any of those callings, church becomes riveting. Like if you are invested in those people and you've gotten to know them, and there's like a handful of people that are struggling with real issues, and you've been their bishop or their counselor or their home teacher, and you're watching sacrament meeting, it can become one of the most riveting 90 minutes or an hour and 15 minutes of your week. But if you're not invested, it can be sometimes pretty dry. Sacrament meeting can be pretty boring. I'd say the majority of sacrament meetings I've probably been less than riveted. But I've noticed that what changes is when you know someone or someone's, and they're going through something, and you're quietly witnessing it, and that's when documentary filmmaking becomes fun.
do you come up with a lot of your interview questions for it, or do you have a writer, or do you even write them before you start interviewing them, or is it kind of also just on the fly, like you think of questions while you're talking to them, or do you try to plan out as many as you can?
I've done it both ways. We were on a really big production one time in which we could afford a research assistant, and they would give us questions. I'm pretty collaborative in the way that I work, so this last film, I would always ask the crew that I was working with, if you guys got any questions, either right before we were filming or even during filming. I would say for the most part, I just like to have a conversation and then get them going on something that they're good at talking about, and then stepping back.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, I'm back again. The Morrissey shot, the interview shot. I just loved his interview, like the background and the lighting. Ooh, thank you. The background and the lighting, the angle, everything, it just captured Morrissey, him as an individual, and I thought that was so great. Like, what was the thought process behind that? And were you trying to make it so Morrissey? I loved it.
Well, we tried for months to try and get that interview. When he finally agreed, he was playing a show at the Greek Theater, and we were allowed to come and meet him at his dressing room.
Nice.
And we got access to the dressing room. We got there 2 hours early, and we just lit and lit and lit. And we had the perfect shot. We thought, this is perfect. And then we set up this B camera. Should we set up? We had 2 cameras. Should we set up a second camera? Okay, let's set up a second camera just as safety. And we threw that off to the side. And that's the That's the one
That's
we
the
used. So, I'm glad you like that shot. I love it too. He is a very difficult person not to shoot from a great angle. He's just so dashing, handsome, debonair, and you could shoot him on an iPhone and it would look fantastic.
Right. That's awesome. So my other question was concerning Morrissey and all the artists, Iggy Pop. Like, how did you get some of the interviews that you wanted from these people, and how did you get in contact with them, and what was the process in also getting their music in the film, the relationships with all of them?
Yeah, it was a lot of hustle. Most of those interviews came. There's a guy named Ed Cunningham who we just gave him the job when we were filming the reunion concert. All kinds of rock royalty in London showed up. So that's where Bob Geldof, Chrissy Hines, Mick Jones of The Clash, and all of these Serious Tricks and all these other people were there. And this guy played football in the NFL, and we just said we were invited to the after party, and we set up a room right next to the after party, which if you're quiet, you could kind of hear going on. And this football player would go through and grab Mick Jones by the scruff of his neck, half inebriated Mick Jones, and just bring him into our interview setting and plop him down. In Iggy Pop, he was at a music festival where the remaining members of the Dolls were playing post Arthur's passing, and we had read that he was a huge fan of the Dolls. He had partied with the Dolls. He knew them. And so we were outside his tour bus, and we just told his manager, this is what we're doing. It'll take 30 seconds. And he was just great. He came out to the door of his tour bus, and the interview probably lasted 90 seconds.
Nice.
And he gives you that great little quote.
Yeah, that's cool. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's gonna have to.
Yeah.
What's up?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm Grant. Good to meet you over
Good to meet you.
Google or whatever this is. So I think a lot of us as digital media majors and artists and kids kind of living in the small town of Salt Lake City have kind of wondered, like, because you're from Idaho, correct? Did I hear that?
Both my parents are from Idaho. I grew up in Seattle.
You grew up in Seattle, okay. So I've always thought, like, kind of to really make it big or to really, like, find people or make connections, you kind of have to move to a big city like Los Angeles. So, but the film and the audio industry, I'm an audio major, but I would love to get into film as well. They're growing here in Salt Lake, but what would you recommend? Because, I mean, if you hadn't been, for example, in LA, in that ward, you never would have met, Arthur. And so, like, what are your thoughts on that? As far as
I mean, if I'm just speaking from my personal experience, that is definitely true. There's so many jobs that happen just organically. You're out and you run across somebody that you haven't seen for a couple of months. I mean, you go to any coffee shop or any restaurant or just walking down the street in LA, and you're rubbing shoulders with people who make films for a living. That's just, that town is built on that industry. And when you see these people, they'll either think of a project they're working on, oh, Greg would be perfect for this, or vice versa. So those things happen less in small towns. It's just your hit rate's going to be fewer. However, on the flip side of that, you should talk to Jared Hess, who, as best as I can tell, has never lived in a big city and is doing just fine. So, yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Appreciate it.
I think Rachel will be our last, right? Anyone else? Go for it, Rachel. Pressure's on me, very good. No, I'm good.
Oh wow, I'm really short too.
Yeah, this is the...
Hi.
Hey.
I'm Rachel.
Hi, Rachel.
I had a couple questions. So if the first thing that you started filming on this was him going to the pawn shop, that means every single interview after that was shot after the fact, right?
Well, most of the interviews we shot in London right after the concert. Most of the interviews with rock stars. But we did shoot a handful of them, Morrissey included, after Arthur's passing.
Okay, so like extremely after the fact.
Well, the whole film took us, we from the moment we started filming to the moment we were done was just 6 weeks.
Okay.
With the exception of Morrissey.
In your experience, So when you're making a documentary, you have to create a plot to it, right? And so like the climax of the plot, how often is it that the climax of the documentary plot is like the first thing you shoot? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I have, in my experience, I've usually, there's usually been something that happens in which you go, that's the end. That's the end of the film. And if you're lucky enough to have that happen, then you just sort of start working backwards. Like, what's meaningful about that moment? How do you build to it? If you're telling the story in which that's the climax, how do you get there? I've told people this before. There's this really rudimentary exercise that the good people at Pixar do when they get stuck in a story. They have this very basic way of coming up with an outline. They start by saying, once upon a time there was a blank, and every day blank, until one day blank, because of that blank, because of that blank, until finally blank. And when you fill in all the blanks, that's the structure of your film. Now, when I've used that exercise, I've probably created 20 outlines, trying different, like and what I learn helps me is when I'm out among friends and there's people asking me, whether it's my mother-in-law or friends at church or people that I work with, and they're asking, well, what is it you've been shooting? What have you been working on? And I start telling the story. I can tell when their eyes start to glaze over. I can tell when I start to lose them. So I go, oh. And so pretty soon I get better at telling the story, and that ends up becoming the structure of the movie.
Okay, cool.
Well, Greg, this has been very generous of you and very awesome. We thank you so much, and thank you for Sundance and just everything. You're very generous, and I'm glad that we're friends.
Duane,
So,
I feel and as you know, it's so fun to make these movies, and then it's so fun to talk about them. And the fact that you and your students are interested with these thoughtful questions, I'm just so flattered. I'm just so grateful you'd have me, and we should do it again.
and I love your painting behind your head.
Oh,
by the way.
Do you know what that is?
Of course I know what that is.
My wife thinks I act and look like Gene Wilder in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory.
And please thank your lovely wife. There she is. Thank you for interrupting your hike and everything with this. I really appreciate it. And have a great night.
Thanks, Duane.
Bye-bye.